Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Thunder, and this is Tenor Talks. Tenor Talks, and that is our all things saxophone show between me and my colleague at the Ohio State University, fellow saxophonist educator, Dr. Robert Brooks. And so today's talk is going to be all about technique. We're going to talk about technique. Maybe dispel some myths about technique. Maybe talk about some practical ways to improve your technique, some things you need to be thinking about, and looking forward to having this riveting discussion with Dr. Brooks. So, without further ado, Tenor Talks with Dr. Thunder and Dr. Brooks. Let's go. What's happening?
Hello, good to see you.
Likewise. See you too. I just saw you actually not that long ago.
Yeah, we had studio class this morning and stuff, and I before this, I was took a lap around the oval on campus. It's such nice weather today. Couldn't stay cooped up in my office all day and wasted it. So, so it was
Yes,
good.
yes. Um, so today's talk is about technique. Um,
hmm
and technique is one of these topics where, you know, there's it's almost like it's almost a term that has a negative connotation at times when you're
Mm.
talking about, um, you know, uh, being artistic and um, evoking emotion as a player, all of these kinds of things. A lot of folks will tend to look at technique as a distraction, something that's not necessary, something that perhaps even can limit one's ability to actually,
Hmm.
access more of the artsy
Yeah.
stuff. Now, of course, I don't see it that way. I don't see it as a contradiction at all. I'd argue that technique is is used in every musical expression. There is a particular technique that is being utilized, that's being exploited, right? And
Hmm.
so now, I think narrowly defining technique as being that one guy that can play Flight of the Bumblebees on guitar at 600 BPMs, that has the clock beside him, so in case you thought that he sped the video up, um, and I suppose there is a kind of technique that's associated with playing things fast, but you also need technique to play things slow. So
Hmm.
why don't you share with us some of the things that you teach as far as developing basic technique, um, and I guess it could be anything from like stuff to practice to like as far as like how you hold the horn, maybe other external tools that you may use. I've heard you talk about playing standing in front of a mirror, all that kind of stuff.
Hmm. Yeah, I was just say, really, when I think about technique, and I agree with you talking about, like more broadly defining that. Uh, I I like to think about the word control is kind of more of what I'm trying to do. And I think
Right.
the reason that I like the word control better is because it implies intention. And I think that's, without getting too philosophical with that, I think that's kind of how we can define art, is not that a specific thing happens, but that I choose for whatever that thing to happen. There's a difference between standing up and playing random notes and standing up and playing a great solo, right? Even though, I think about this, a computer could theoretically generate, like a Charlie Parker solo in terms of coming up with notes in that order and doing those things. But ultimately, what is important is the intention behind it and choosing to play something. And we just had great saxophone player Jeff Coffin on campus. And he talked about that sometimes the saxophone plays, you play the saxophone, and sometimes the saxophone plays you, kind of thing. And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
a part of it that I think is important. So I like to use the word, or gaining control. And I even take it a step further sometimes. I refer to the saxophone as a machine. So I want to control the machine a little bit. And that it's a part of, it's operating the instrument. It's thinking about being like a technician in a different way than technique. Because I agree, I think sometimes there can be a negative connotation a bit. So practical stuff, usually we jump right to like finger control. But I think there's technique kind of in everything, that kind of to set you up to control the instrument, control the machine. So one of those things that I use is thinking about posture is a big part of that. And that's, excuse me, uh, posture relates to being relaxed while you play, which I think is important. And I think that can, a lot of times we talk about that in your hands. I want my hands to be relaxed. I don't want to be really stiff, or, be like death gripping the saxophone or something. I want to have flow and a soft touch, right? And flowing motion in my hands. But that also kind of extends, I think, to your body. That's really something I've kind of learned from my wife, who also teaches on faculty at Ohio State in voice, is how important that stuff. She, as a part of her degrees, would take coursework in like Alexander technique and other things, which is really using, your body kind of as an instrument, right? And for us as a complement to our main instrument. And so that's can be a part of it, and that's really where the mirror comes in. You mentioned using a mirror, and it kind of just gives you the visual to be able to see, oh, I'm doing this thing, oh, I'm doing blah blah blah. But obviously, the most crucial part of gaining technique and gaining control is the fingers, right? Is using your fingers efficiently in a controlled way and with intention. So you're not
Mm-hmm.
playing things that just kind of happen. I'm playing smooth, relaxed. My fingers do what I tell them to do. And that mostly comes from, I think, aware repetition. I think mindless repetition will get you so far, but mindless repetition also leads you to go on autopilot sometimes, right? Where I'm playing and then it feels like, oh, I'm playing the same solo, I'm playing whatever. It really needs to be mindful repetition. I'm choosing to play these things over and over again in a methodical way because I need to gain the ability to do that, whatever the thing is, when I choose to, and that gets into the intention. And so it's all kind of in that concept with saxophone. So more practically, I it's kind of funny. My relationship with practicing scales has changed quite a bit. I think, a freshman in college version of myself hated playing scales, avoided it at all costs. I was like the last person in my studio or my class to, get through scales and do all that stuff. And it was just mind numbing. I hated it. Um, and then I think it was really, and it really informs my teaching, of course, but it was really kind of this like journey where I learned how to use scales um, and other technical exercises uh, to, I really had to get the most out of them, really, how to use them to my advantage. I think part of that was I was always told like, oh, you just need to play your scales with a metronome, 100 times a day, and then you're going to be good. And I don't know. I thought I knew better, I guess, maybe, or something, but I was never really interested in doing that stuff. And so really what it came to me was using scales as a vehicle to gain mindful repetition on all of the skills I need to do as a player, right? And all of those things are technique, right? So controlling dynamics is technique, articulation is technique. Obviously, playing scales fast is technique too, right? Playing slowly is a part of that. Having rhythmic control when you're playing that stuff is a part of it. So obviously, playing major scales, I think, and I work through with high school students all the way through our college students and beyond, through major scales, harmonic minor, melodic, the ascending form of melodic minor, and then harmonic major. And then I have several patterns that I kind of have, basic patterns that I have students go through. One of those is a full, like a full arranged scale, thirds patterns, what I call inverted thirds patterns, a chord scale pattern, which is an arpeggio followed by a scale down, and then arpeggio snake, which is going through the modes in numerical order up and down through their arpeggios. And kind of what I work on with that is a big part of that is, okay, I'm going to be able to play these things. Here's this scale. I can execute it at a certain tempo. But then it starts to get into reliability. You're working on focus when you're working on those patterns and things like that. I'm working on my sound concept, depending on if I play with a drone, I'm working on pitch. If I play with a metronome that's clicking every other measure on beat 4, I'm working on my time and control, and all of those things are a part of technique. And so really kind of throughout my college experience, I was really focused on, kind of at the beginning, a little bit of like avoiding scales, but through that I became focused on, oh, this is really an important part of building a foundational base to my playing that allows me, and kind of like what you said, allows me to play what I want to play.
Yep.
Right. And you can certainly overuse technique, right? There are certainly musicians who that is the only thing they have going, right? But
Well,
ultimately what technique
if it's
does
as
is
you're defining it, overuse an aspect of technique. They're
yeah,
very flashy. They're playing a lot of notes, but that's only one aspect, because even when they play slower, they're still using a technique
yeah,
to
absolutely.
access that. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. Yeah, but and that's kind of where I'm going with it, is that
right,
you
right.
really, what the technique does is it allows me to execute what I want to do, whatever that is. So you're right. When I play slowly, when I play with dynamics, when I play with articulation, when I play complex rhythmic structures or simple rhythmic things, all of those things are a product of technique, right? And I think that's true in any art medium, right? There's technique in visual art and painting, right? And maybe the art I want to do is really impressionistic or is paint splatter or something, but that has technique related to it. So that's all of it is there. It is truly the foundation of what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me acknowledge the super sticker. C. Ray Rogers with the 4.99s. Thank you very much for that. Thanks for the support. In a previous comment, he said that also strategic incidental repeats. Showing my support, Doc. I love these. Much appreciated for that. All right. Yeah, the technique conversation is interesting. Because of course there's more than one way to develop technique, different techniques, or even the same technique. People have different approaches. Now, there are some usual strategies, stuff like scales, full range scales, variety of practice, both slurred and a variety of articulations. There is scales and thirds. There are arpeggios, both of the formulas for that, which is like, what is it, 1-3-5-7, 8-7-5-3-1, or 1-3-5-7, 8-6-4-2. One, that sort of format where you play the notes that you didn't play about on the way back down. Obviously, stuff like practicing in 12 keys. All of everybody, nobody is nobody that can actually play, that has a lot of, like, when you listen to them, you're like, man, they can play. None of those guys avoided practicing in 12 keys. 0%. It's a 0%.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, there are a few things on the saxophone that are really specific, and though some players will still use the sort of side B flat fingering. Some players do that, but most of the sort of just prodigious technical facility players, they're favoring Bisbee flat. So there is stuff like that.
Yeah.
There's one of the things I mentioned about stuff like and you said this, the thing about not having like a stranglehold on the instrument, but being loose, because when you're like this, you can't play fast, you can't play light.
Yep.
Right. I think of this sort of bass technique that I try to approach the instrument with as sort of like like a typist, on a keyboard, right?
Oh yeah.
My sister's a really fast typist. She's like 100 words per minute easy. No mistake, hardly makes any mistakes. It's pretty incredible. And if you were to look at any of her keyboards, or any typist that really types well, you'll notice that all their keyboards have the same wear patterns. It's because you can't type fast if where you touch the keys is all over the place. It has to be really very restricted, very consistent, and that's what actually facilitates speed and accuracy. I'd say the same thing is true about the saxophone. Now, saxophone, especially tenor, it seems like you can get away with a lot, right? And a lot of times, the right hand will be draped over the pearls. But one thing to note is whenever it's necessary to really play something that's technical, you'll notice that even players that seem like that they have bad habits, they're leaning back in the chair, they're bad posture, their hands draped over the keys, they're doing all kind of wild and stuff, they're doing all this kind of stuff when they're playing or whatever. Notice that when they have to play something that is really technical and has to be correct, all of that stuff, they knock off all of that stuff and get right to business. And then maybe they start doing the failing and stuff afterwards again. So, and one player in particular that I think about, that I think young students, they get distracted by this, is Chris Potter. So Chris Potter does this thing with his left arm when he's playing. He does this thing, right? And the thing is that when you look at Chris and he's doing all of this, and you're young, you don't really know that much about music, and you hear how incredible he plays, then you're like, well, maybe this is associated with all that great stuff that he can play. Maybe I need to start doing this chicken wing thing, right? But something to notice is that whenever he really has to nail something and he's going for all that crazy acrobatic stuff, notice that he knocks all that off. He don't do that anymore. It's all right here. And then after that, then maybe he goes back to it again. But so that's I think something to note. One other thing that I'll add on this, because it's really easy to get fixated on the wrong stuff. So one of the things that I've noted is, so Kenny G, right? Kenny G plays with the horn like cockeyed. I don't know if you notice this, but it's like the horn. Everybody, I'm sure, to know this is, So the horn is like cockeyed, especially when he's playing soprano. You really can tell how cockeyed. He's not playing straight. The horn is not coming straight out. It's like cockeyed like this. And and I discovered that the reason why he does that is because his hero was David Sanborn. And David Sanborn, who had polio, the reason that David played that way is because that's the only way that David could play. So then what happens is, right, so then Kenny G emulates something that was not contributing to the way that David sounds, had nothing to do with that, but was more of like a style almost sort of thing. I'm not necessarily opposed to people having a particular style associated with the way that they play, as long as it's not taking away from anything. However, I think it's important that we point out the stuff that has nothing to do with the sound. It has nothing to do with the ability to play, a lot of facility, having a facility, accuracy, intonation, all of the stuff that you need to play, having a good sound, the stuff that actually matters. So what do you think?
That's interesting. I mean, just from a trivia standpoint, I didn't know about the polio. I've always noticed that with David Sanborn that he always plays kind of up like that. I didn't realize that. Interesting.
Right. It's up and cockeyed sort of to one side.
Yeah, that's interesting. Huh.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree. My teacher in undergrad was pretty old school and cut all the dancing and stuff out. And the way that he described that was he really got into, and this is a big part of my teaching, is really got into efficiency, right? That I don't want to be rocking around and moving around because it's kind of like wasted energy, and it sets you up to possibly make a mistake. It might be easier if I'm off balance, or kind of like the
Yep.
typing thing and stuff you're talking about. So I think that stuff makes total sense. Um, I think something else that you mentioned about the side B flat versus bis B flat, I think that's kind of interesting. I maybe have like a unique take on that, or maybe not, because like I said, my teacher is pretty old school, and he's was in my undergrad was is exclusively classical, or pretty close to that. So he always wanted us to play side B flat all the time, and that
Mm.
was like the right way to do it. And then obviously when I studied with jazz musicians, it's the opposite. Oh, I want to play B flat, and I kind of used I actually kind of use both for different reasons, and part of that is uh, kind of comes into context a little bit. So a lot of times I'll tell students that when a note is written as B flat, I use bis, and when it's written as A sharp, I use the long fingering. And a part of that is because often what the positive of using bis B flat is that it locks me into playing B flat, because there are not, at least for major scales, and we're thinking about very broadly about that, there aren't scales that have both. There's B major, F sharp major that have A sharp and B natural, and then I want to be able to go in between. But that's kind of a specific, and we can, certainly can get pretty deep into that. But I
Yep.
generally, and part of that because of the keys that we normally play in on tenor, I'm almost always using the bis B flat and things like that.
Well,
Yeah, I
one
think that
thing,
stuff
if I can
is
add something
yeah,
here,
sure.
one thing that playing bis B flat, especially if you're going to almost exclusively use bis B flat, it requires a particular technique, a rotation technique. So you have to do this thing
Mm.
with your hand, and the rotation actually
Mhm.
is not in your hand. It's down your arm actually. Because
Mhm.
your hand doesn't really rotate like that. I mean, you can do this, but any rotation is really actually originating, so almost like back here in your elbow or something, right?
Yeah.
And so for instance, if I was playing like a bebop scale, say if I was playing C, Mixolydian bebop, where the chromatic passing tone is at the top, usually what people just
Mhm.
call C bebop scale. If I was going to use bis B flat, which I ordinarily would, I'd have to play C, then B, and then I'd have to do that rotation to get to the B flat.
Yeah.
It also requires that weird sort of putting your finger in between. Man, I don't have a sax.
Yeah.
My
Nearby.
horns are packed up because I got a gig later, or else I'll grab a
Mhm.
horn. But you have to have your finger like in between the keys, so that you can access both the bis and the B key at the same time, because you
Yeah.
don't access bis B flat by lifting your finger up and let me press the bis key. No, it's always you're always rotating to access the
Mhm.
bis key, which is one of the most it's a very specific technique to have. I can't think of another instrument where that specific rotational sort of technique where you have to have your finger in between two keys. I can't think of another.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it is similar to, and we talked about this on the doubling day. It's similar to the teardrop key on clarinet, but your
Okay,
finger
yeah,
really
that's
isn't
right.
in between those keys. I am rolling, but it's not this kind of in between. I have my horn here because I was teaching a lesson right before this, and when I think about playing,
Yep, yep,
that's the natural position. And
that's
then
right.
it's almost
Yep.
like I will come up sometimes. But I notice that even when I notice this, I think it's funny. If in my mind I think, I'm going to play D major, my finger automatically gets off of that key, right? Or if I think, oh, I'm going to
Oh
put
yeah,
my fingers
right.
on and think E flat, then I go on there because it locks me in I can't play a wrong note. I'm locked into playing B flat, and then I change keys and then move over
Right.
and stuff like that. So yeah, I totally agree on that. I think that's an interesting way to talk about it for sure.
And then this is interesting too because I've actually I'd say, well, okay. So if we talk about an aspect of the saxophone lineage at Ohio State on the classical side. So Jim Hill, who was the predecessor of Michael Torres, right? So, in both Michael Torres and Jim Hill studied with Hemke, right? And both of them almost exclusively use Bisbee flat.
Interesting.
Very much so. And matter of fact, I remember having conversations with Jim, and he told me that a saxophone player, like students, when he gets students, that would be a question that he would ask them: do you use Bisbee flat? Because he believed that students that couldn't use Bisbee flat, it was a handicap. So it's really interesting. There's all these different sort of philosophies on Bisbee flat.
Yeah, it's kind of a controversial. I also had I met a person in my past, this is more anecdotal than anything else, who was absolutely convinced that it was the bisque key, as in a soup. He would say, so I would say, oh, it's a Bisbee flat, and he would go bisque key, and I said, there's no way that's right. There's no way it's that. I was proud of that.
That's great.
It's like, hey, you can take this off of your saxophone. Have a nice soup. I always think of that. I always think it's hilarious.
That is funny.
Yeah.
Okay, so one thing I wanted to get into a little bit, and this is an interesting topic, because I believe that most teachers have been teaching their students incorrectly with respect to developing speed. I know that's a bold statement. It's a bold statement. Okay, so this is something, and I used to teach this way too. I used to say the same thing, and that is, you have to play slow to play fast. Play slow to play fast. If you take something, if you want to play something at a tempo, play it slow, and then you'll be able to do it. This is a regular thing. It's like a reflex action almost. Like it's such common advice. Now, there's a few problems with that assessment. Okay. One of the problems with that assessment is that the physics are all different. The physics are different at every tempo. Okay. Now, this is particularly true when you consider plectrum mechanics. So I'm going to talk guitar for a little bit here. So, what is this? McGrady. I can't think of the guy's first name right now, but he's got a series of videos called Cracking the Code. And what he did is, Troy Grady, I think is the guy's name. I'll verify this before we're done. And so he knows of these great guitar players, like legendary guitar players, a lot of them like shred machines, like dudes that can play unbelievable stuff. And he put this video camera on their guitar, and then he would ask them about what it was that they were doing, and the camera was capturing the plectrum mechanics, the angle, the distance from the strings, and then he was also monitoring if it was coming from the elbow or coming from the wrist, all kinds of things, what kind of angle that they were holding the pick from, all kinds of stuff. And so, of course, he found a lot of like variance in this.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, all kind of variance in this. So one thing that he found was that when they would say what it was that they were doing, like they were teaching a lesson, often was the case that they were not doing what it was that they were telling their students to do. Like even when they were demonstrating, they would be like, hey, you got to do this and make sure you keep this distance and blah, 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 and all like this. Got to play slow to play fast and like this. And notice it'll be the same, but my technique will be the same all the way up to every tempo and like this. And actually, what he discovered is that the technique is completely different at every tempo. 100, it was like not even playing the same stuff. So different. Because, of course, as they get faster, the arc of motion becomes very much smaller, and it takes a different sort of force from a different part of your arm to still get enough, you don't think of guitar as needing power, but enough force to get over the string, right? Because when you're playing at a slower tempo and you're moving bigger motions, you don't need as much strength from other places. Right. So anyhow, it's just a bunch of really interesting research, associated with this. And then I started thinking about the relationship between that and, in particular, playing saxophone. And I noted the same sort of things, where when you're playing things slowly, you're almost exaggerating the motions because you're trying to really like cement that, like, this is what this feels like. And not necessarily playing with a lot of key clack, but definitely a very mechanical, snappy kind of motion that's happening as you're playing slow. And then what starts to happen is as you speed up, a lot of that clack disappears because you can't use the same amount of force. You have to lighten up as you get faster. And so this advice that play something slow to play fast is actually wrong. Now, one thing that is true about it is that if you cannot play something slowly, then you're not going to be able to play it fast. So yes, it is a prerequisite to being able to speed up, but actually what will develop a person's technique and speed at a particular tempo is actually playing it at that tempo. Now, you may have to go through a bunch of other tempos to get to that tempo, but you're not actually developing the muscle memory for playing something at a tempo by playing it slower.
Mm-hmm.
In
it's interesting to hear
respects.
you kind of talk about that. Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about that because to me, I think when I've had teachers in the past that say, we got to play slow to be able to play fast, kind of my takeaway and kind of how I phrase that to my students is, you need to play fast how you would play slow. And so for me, what that means is being relaxed, is very light touch, and not having a lot of extra movement. And grab my horn again. That's a big thing. It's a lot easier when I have plenty of time to play, with my fingers moving around and getting away from the keys. But when I'm playing quickly, I don't have as much time, so I need to be really close. And that's what I want to be able to do kind of like all the time. Right. And I often think about, that when I'm playing scale patterns or transcriptions or etudes or whatever, really on any instrument, even on doubles that we talked about, was that last week or 2 weeks ago?
That was
but when we were talking about that is it really... Yeah, that slower tempo should feel like a fast tempo in slow motion. That my technique shouldn't change as much as possible, and that I'm like emulating fast technique when I play slow. It's interesting though about like,
I think it is possible to minimize how much difference there is.
Yeah, I'm sure it's impossible for it to be absolutely identical.
But it's not right. But it's not going to actually be the same. And then we also have to talk about air. So obviously, air at a slow tempo is not the same air as the fast tempo. It's just not.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead and say what you're going to say.
Well, it was really just that. I mean, it was that I'm trying to emulate, a lack of extra motion. I'm trying to be efficient and light, and because those are the things I need to do when I play fast, and they will also work slowly. And that's kind of how I always have interfaced with the play slow to play fast thing. I think of another terrible joke I use because it's memorable, and that's the most important part with teaching, especially stuff that's a little less fun, like technique practice and stuff like that. It's bad band director joke I learned a while ago, so I'll use it on you. And when I'm teaching someone good saxophone technique, I'll ask them. I said, "What do you call the distance between the key and your finger when you play?" And of course, they don't know. And then you call it room for error, and then you roll your eyes, and it's like, "Oh God," right? But it's the thing that kind of I just always remember this as this terrible joke. And it can be another kind of thing in terms of efficiency and light touch. And obviously, if I have all that space when I'm trying to play really quick, it becomes very difficult to control. No. Yeah, and so I need it to always be very tight and light, but very controlled and stuff like that. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I'd be interested in kind of learning more about some of the study stuff. Or you said people have done it on guitar. Is there a similar thing for saxophone specifically, like with a camera like that?
No, there isn't. But just thinking through.
Yeah, it makes sense. I just didn't know.
Yeah. It seems like it will be a lot of the same principles would be at work. I remember. When I took the job at Ohio State, it seems like maybe the second year I was on the job, I started playing bass. So it was back in like 2005. And so I'd be in my office practicing bass a lot. And the bass professor, Dr. Paul Robinson, he would stop at my office sometimes, and he'd knock on my door, and I'd open up. He says, "Oh, okay, yeah." And he says, "Is that a 7-string bass?" And I was like, "Yeah." He says, "Yeah, you should tune that like a guitar." And that's actually when I started tuning my bass like a guitar in the top, just an octave lower. So it would be B, E, A, D, G, B, E, right? Like a 7-string guitar tuning, but just an octave lower. And he says, if you do that, you'll be able to play all kind of stuff other bass players can't play, because you'd have at your disposal all this classical repertoire for guitar, for guitar, and you can just read guitar music and stuff like this, and tab and stuff like this. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. For about the first month and a half, I thought it was a terrible mistake. And then I started to get used to it, and I was like, okay. So then when I switched to guitar, I didn't switch to guitar. When I added guitar, I already knew where the notes were and a bunch of chord shapes and stuff, because I had been working them out. But I said that to say this, as far as like the distance, space between your hands and the board, one thing that he told me to do was to put a piece of paper underneath the strings. And how did that work?
Probably on top, so you can't get too far away. Yeah,
right, because the paper would move if your finger wasn't if your fingers weren't actually still in contact. And I remember really, really having a lot of issues with that. It took me a long time before I was able to actually do that, because there seemed to be like some sort of link between me learning something new or something. I'm not sure what it was, and some sort of exaggerated something was going on with my hand. That wasn't the case when I played at a tempo. And now that's, right, wrong, or indifferent. I think that is a common thing that most players have, is that we recognize in our mind that we can get away with more at a slower tempo, and we recognize that we have to become more efficient and lighter as we build up speed. Now, I like what it was that you were saying about playing slow like you would play fast. That seems to be what you were saying. But I still have an issue with this idea, play slow to play fast, because you're never going to develop the ability to play really fast just by being able to master something at a slow tempo. You have to push against it's there's a lot of gravity that's pushing against you
Yeah.
as you try to climb in tempos, and
Hmm.
you're never going to have the ability to play those fast things by playing slow. The other thing I would say is there's also sort of an inclination to play fast. One of our students was saying, in studio class today that he plays a lot more saxophone than he ever does when he plays a solo, right? And that's because that's not a technique issue. That's a mind issue,
Hmm.
right? And so you may actually have the facility, but not have the inclination to use it. Um, and
Hmm.
and I get into this thing about double time and all this kind of stuff. It's not just about can you play it. Is like, are you going to actually do it when it's time to do
Hmm.
it? And for
Yeah,
a
that's
lot of guys,
interesting.
the answer is no.
Yeah. Hmm. It's interesting to hear you talk about like the paper stuff and kind of like tools like that. That's certainly something I was taught and then teach students with technique and closeness and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've never done that, and I think that's probably better than what I've done in the past, which is you roll up a little piece of tape
Mm-hmm.
on the pearl of a saxophone, and then I always thought, oh well, then and that's kind of what my experience was. I get too far away that it pulls on my finger a little bit,
Oh,
and I
right,
become
right.
aware of that. But the
Yeah.
paper thing would work on saxophone too. If you had a little square of paper,
Mm-hmm.
then it would fall away. That would
Right.
be that'd be an interesting way to kind of to
You,
do
you,
that
you,
same.
you could do super glue. I've got some super glue right here. You can put
Oh
super glue on
no,
your fingers.
that's dedication. I'm not that dedicated.
That's right. Oh,
One
then
of
your
the kind of
fingers
the
really would be glued to the
kind of
keys.
thinking about uh, keeping an eye on time a little bit, but thinking about like practical tips and stuff.
Sure.
Um, something that I work on with students a lot is a lot of times what I call the pinky rule. And
Mm.
often you think about the physicality of how your hands are made, right? And that
Yeah.
you have this like there's like a tendon linkage between your pinky and your ring finger, a little bit into your middle finger, but you know your thumb and your index finger, are a lot more independent than these other fingers are. It's a lot harder to like just close one finger and the other ones don't
Yep.
move and stay relaxed, right? You really got to like focus and kind of develop that. Most people, it's kind of leading, and it can be, and that's I'm sure something that you also do on guitar, right? Finger independence, I
Right.
think, is a transferable skill, and it manifests differently, but it's functionally this, at least a similar thing. And so a lot of times on saxophone, I will joke that the pinkies are the leaders of the resistance. So if I have a
Yeah.
pinky that is crazy, it often leads these other fingers to also being kind of crazy a little bit. And so a lot of times when I have students kind of to more than I do the tape, that's kind of extreme. And I honestly I think I like the paper thing better because it's a little more individualized too. And I can see when it happens as a teacher. Is the pinky rule. So that means that I usually have students and I anchor my pinky on the low B key. Part of that's a comfort thing. A part of that is it's easy to do that stuff. That's actually something I learned from Chris Potter when I worked with him. You mentioned him before. He anchors his pinky on his C sharp key, and he doesn't use the G sharp at all.
Yeah. On
He
one of
said
his
that way,
horns, he
like,
doesn't even have a G sharp key.
yeah, exactly. Like it's not a part of it. So, but I anchor mine kind of on the inside of B, and then I will have students do this when they play their scales. We play really slowly because we're focusing on finger efficiency. Will be I don't care what your other fingers do. The pinkies have to stay in contact with low B and low C, and then it makes it almost impossible. It's really really difficult if I'm fingering an A and I keep this pinky down, like that's about as high as I can physically get my ring finger. It's like
I
not
see.
not
Yeah.
really even
Yep.
enough to get
Yep.
another finger in there. And
Yep.
it kind of forces my technique to be a little bit tighter. And then the other thing that I noticed too is that it gets me used to a light touch because I'm not pressing my pinky keys, but I have to still feel that they're in contact.
Right.
And then that takes a little bit of the pressure off. And that can be kind of a humbling experience sometimes, especially if you're, more of an intermediate player or more of an advanced player and you want to, I want to improve my technique. Can I sit down and play easy scales, couple octaves on C major, couple octaves on F major, and my pinkies are always in contact with those keys, and you'll notice, oh man, my fingers are really used to doing something else, or not. I mean, maybe you already have great technique, but that was a really kind of when I first learned how to do that, it was really humbling. And
Yep.
that was always the biggest thing. My teacher in grad school is a fantastic saxophone player, probably one of the best, like physical. I talked about before, like operating the machine. Like physical saxophone player is just mind blowing, the things that he could do to that saxophone. I almost felt bad for his horn sometimes. And but that was always the biggest thing. And I had this memory that I got really used to when I was around other saxophone players and I wanted to like steal their licks. I got too reliant on watching their fingers instead of listening. And I would sit there and what is he playing? Oh, that was this note. Oh, that was this note. And I noticed that Chip's technique was so good, I had a really hard time doing that because his fingers moved like the bare minimum all the time. And so it made it difficult to read his fingers because it wasn't obvious. It wasn't, this is an F and E, and it wasn't, these like big motions. It
Right.
would be, he's playing all this stuff all over the horn as these like little tiny light twitching stuff. So that can be something, and that's something that I will give to students almost as just like a thing to explore. Go practice all the stuff that you've been practicing, practice your piece or your etude or whatever it is, but I want you to focus on your pinkies being in contact. And a lot of times it's kind of ends up being this mind-blowing thing for students, and they work to it kind of gives them a novel way to improve their technique, and start to gain awareness with their fingers, like kind of like I was talking about at the beginning. So
Yeah, that's interesting. So with some of the different ways that we try to improve our technique and approaches, and paper or pinkies touching, or a lot of these different things, really focusing on like this kind of loose grips, you're not squeezing the horn, the typewriter illustration I gave, all of that kind of stuff, minimizing the amount of motion, touching your keys, always touching the keys in the same way, in the same spot, all of that kind of stuff. Now I'd have to do some more research on this and I have to think about it more, but because of the limitation, because of the tendons that shared between these two fingers, it seems to me that it invariably there's going to have to be some sort of there would have to be some sort of a note combination that would cause you to have to move your hand if you want to play it quickly.
Yeah. And that kind of gets into the fast playing is different because it might be easier to achieve that slowly, but quickly I might need it to be a different motion. Yeah.
Or vice versa. It might be that the additional speed means that that finger doesn't have to move as much or something. I don't know. Maybe that doesn't make sense, but it's it's interesting that the technique sort of discussion is an important discussion. And even when you watch players like Charlie Parker, he had really good technique. His fingers were right there on the keys when he's playing all that incredible stuff. It's because his fingers are right there. He's touching the keys. He was glued to the keys. Okay, all right.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say one more thing too. Sure. Any great repair tech will also be appreciative when you have good technique because your horn doesn't need as much work. You're not slamming the keys constantly and
Oh,
getting them. It's a lot gentler. It's a lot easier to keep your horn. You don't have to go in as much. You're not spending as much money on it. It's, that light touch goes a really long way into keeping your instrument from getting at least leaks as quickly. I mean, no matter what, you will develop leaks as a part of kind of the an imperfect system. But I think that
so
goes a
are
long
you
way
telling me
too.
are you telling me that I have great technique? Because one
I
of my
am.
horns hasn't been in for 7 years.
I was gonna say, because you never have your horns worked on.
Right. No. Well, I mean, I have to blow really hard. It's really
Yeah,
squeeze, but hey, I don't have to take it.
but it works. Yeah, and a lot of the pads, the pads kind of will make a squeaking sound when I push them down.
That's right. All right.
That's
All
funny.
right,
That's
man.
funny.
Yeah. All right, man.
Cool.
Well, good. You have a final word you want to say there?
Uh, that nothing more than technique is important, because it kind of what I said before. It's that foundation. All right, I can't build a house without a solid foundation. So all of the other things that I want to be able to do, or you want to be able to do as a saxophone player, like you said, come out of technique. They come out of control and intention. And so the sooner you kind of accept that and make it an important part of your practice, all of the other skills you have as a musician will also grow as a result.
Yep. All right. And on that note, we'll be back next week. Make sure you come back for that, and also check out the other episodes of Tenor Talks. I think we've done 6 of these or something like that now. All really important topics, all centered around the saxophone. And yeah, so we'll see you next time. Be well.
Right.
Peace.